process all of this. But what you can do is pick an issue that's important to you, stay in that lane and follow it, and just try to figure out, what can be done in this area. And I think what we've saw in terms with all these executive orders from the Trump administration, clearly there has been a series designed to make life absolutely miserable for transgender people, to deny them access to identity documents, to deny even their existence by the federal government, to deny them protections against discrimination, to deny them the ability to go to school and learn in a safe and supporting learning environment. And then, of course, I'm generalizing. There were so many different orders that were issued, but probably what you're here most to hear about is to deny them access to life-saving, medically necessary care. The second thing I want to say is everything that has come out in these executive orders were verbatim in Project 2025. And you recall during the campaign that then candidate Donald Trump said he had no idea what Project 2025 was, and it had absolutely nothing to do with his campaign. And of course, many of us talked about what was in that Project 2025 and how dangerous it was. Um, the other thing I think it's important to keep in mind is really to have an understanding about civics and what these things are. What is an executive order? An executive order is a policy directive that comes out of the executive branch, the president's office. It's not a law. It's not something that automatically wipes out laws and protections that already exist. It's not something that Congress can overturn, although they can pass laws to make it difficult for implementing an executive order. It's up to our courts to actually provide a check and balance on the executive branch with regards to those orders. And usually under the Administrative Procedures Act, when you issue an executive order, there's a process before this order is actually implemented. In other words, you have to direct different departments of the government to come up with proposed either regulations or policies, which are then put forth before the public and usually allow some time to be able to comment on those things. And then sometimes that's when we see the legal challenges against them. So it's not that, okay, he writes something and all of a sudden it becomes law. We don't have, believe it or not, we don't have a dictatorship in terms of our form of democracy. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. So I guess, Jenny, maybe the next thing is just kind of provide a little review of what the executive order said concerning gender affirming care. One of the things in the first series of executive orders was this phrase that said, no federal funds shall be used to promote gender ideology. Kind of very vague and ambiguous term. What is gender ideology? But the idea is that we're not going to allow any federal funds to be used to support that. And I think this group, we had a conversation a month or two ago about, does that mean like no federal Medicaid dollars can be spent on gender affirming care? And if that was to take effect, what does that mean in Michigan? Could Michigan separate state Medicaid dollars to be able to continue providing for gender affirming care? And we believe that the state could do that. But the next executive order that was issued on January 28th, a week later, went much further. What they wanted to do is they wanted to prevent programs, any programs, and including in good states like the state of Michigan, from providing gender affirming care. So the executive order that was issued last week said, we will take away federal funding from any hospital, healthcare center, university, any grant that we've already, agreed to do. We will take that away if you are providing gender affirming care, irregardless of whether you're using federal monies to pay for that gender affirming care. Just based on the fact that you're offering this gender affirming care, we're gonna threaten and take away your federal funding. And as a follow-up to that order, the HRSA, who does a lot of the grants, issued an email to a lot of grant funded and medical programs that receive federal funding saying, if you don't stop providing gender affirming care, we're going to take away your federal dollars. Now, at the same time that this was happening from HRSA, there was a lawsuit, two lawsuits brought against the Trump administration. You also probably heard, this was just last week, that there was a freeze on federal spending, right? All these different federal grants and programs that had already been committed to, through federal funding, they had put a freeze on it. And there were at least two lawsuits filed against it. One of the lawsuits that was filed against it was brought on behalf of 22 attorney generals from various states. Michigan was one of the states that joined in this lawsuit. And on Friday, a judge in Rhode Island issued a preliminary injunction against enforcement of that freeze, basically saying any commitments that the federal government has made to to various programs, hospitals, healthcare centers, you cannot undo this. You are enjoined from taking any steps that would eliminate that kind of funding that was made available. As follow-up to that preliminary injunction, the Department of Justice also issued something to the Office of Budget and Management saying this means commitments that you have made in terms of federal grants pertaining to a lot of different things, including diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, as well as gender affirming care, you can't, based on this injunction, you can't take away that federal funding based on this court order. So, in other words, the current threat to programs that get federal dollars, even if they're not using federal dollars for doing gender affirming care, at this point in time is not there, according to this preliminary injunction. Unfortunately, what we've been seeing are a number of healthcare programs that are offering gender affirming care that are shutting down or stopping providing gender affirming care, or saying that they will no longer take new patients who are seeking gender affirming care. They've been canceling appointments. And some of you might be aware that yesterday, and the reason I mentioned, I'm going to talk about New York, because it's a very similar situation in Michigan. Yesterday, New York's Attorney General, why am I blanking out her name? Tish, I am sorry. Anyway, their Attorney General in New York issued a letter to all hospitals and healthcare centers telling them, one, because of this injunction, you're not in danger right now of losing your federal funds. And two, because New York has civil rights protections against discrimination for transgender people, you can't stop providing these services, and telling them not to end in terms of their gender affirming care. I believe that the same thing holds true for the state of Michigan. We have comprehensive civil rights protections under our state civil rights law. We have the explicit categories of gender identity and gender expression. And, it covers not only employment, housing, education, but also this large umbrella term called public accommodations, which would include healthcare services. And all these programs in Michigan that are offering gender affirming care, they are subject to this. So there's no reason, there is no legal order or law that is mandating that the program should shut down. And some of you might also be aware that this afternoon, the National ACLU, as well as Lambda, filed a lawsuit on behalf of transgender individuals, as well as their families, as well as the PFLAG, Parents, Friends, and Lesbian and Gays organization, challenging this executive order and raising a number of legal issues. First of all, that the executive order has exceeded its authority. In other words, it's Congress that appropriates a budget in terms of how much money we're going to spend and makes decisions as to who's going to receive the money. It's not the executive branch, and that President Trump, in issuing this order, has exceeded his authority. Also, that this executive order violates prohibitions on sex discrimination under the Affordable Care Act. That's the federal law that says if you're providing healthcare services, you cannot discriminate against individuals on the basis of sex. We know that other federal courts have looked at discrimination against transgender people in terms of healthcare services and said that they are protected under the Affordable Care Act, Section 1557, which is the non-discrimination provision. Another claim that is mentioned in the lawsuit is disability discrimination, that being diagnosed with gender dysphoria constitutes a disability, and that this executive order aims to provide to prohibit the provision of medically necessary care only for people who've been diagnosed with this condition of gender dysphoria that is discriminatory. Another claim is that this violates equal protection. That's a clause in our Constitution that says that you can't single out a group of people for discrimination. The government can't do that unless there is some form of legal justification to do that. And then the final claim is that it violates the due process rights. In other words, it seeks to aim to cut off medical care for and let's make something clear. We're not even just talking about transgender youth. We're talking about transgender people who are 18 years old, less than 19 years old. They're legal adults. They have the legal ability, to consent to their own medical care. They are included in this. And we are also seeing, in terms of programs trying to shut down or stop services, yesterday I was contacted by somebody in Michigan who receives services in Isabella County, a medical program, who's 25 years old. And they stopped his gender affirming care, saying it's because of this executive order, which of course is not true. So what this lawsuit seeks is for the judge to issue what's called a preliminary injunction. In other words, a preliminary injunction usually is issued when you see there's so much harm that could come to people right now that the court needs to put on pause, needs to put on hold a particular provision, executive order, policy, and then allow for time for briefing, legal briefing, and analysis, and determining whether or not that preliminary injunction should result in a longer injunction to prevent from this taking effect. So this case was just filed this afternoon, and it's our hope that within the next couple of days, a judge will render a decision on whether or not to issue an injunction against enforcing this. But of course, as I mentioned before, we're already seeing the harm being done. And I think even the Trump administration gleefully said, that they're already shutting down gender affirming care programs. And, we're just kind of doing by piecemeal. When we hear about a program saying you should be shutting down, these are the reasons, maybe suddenly threatening to file a civil rights complaint against a medical program with the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. I saw something, I just was glancing quickly in the chat room. Has Attorney General Dana Nessel done a similar letter like that? She hasn't done yet. We've requested that she would do something like that. We think it would be very helpful, but we haven't gotten any response with regards to that at this point in time. That's what we know so far. And I just want to say another thing. What is this purpose behind these executive orders? Well, obviously, it's, as I mentioned to you before, it's making life miserable for transgender people. It's trying to erase the visibility of transgender people. There's an executive order dealing with public schools, threatening to take away any federal funding from public schools that acknowledge transgender people, students that refer to them based on their names and pronouns, that permits them to access restrooms in accordance with their gender identity. There's language in an executive order redefining, taking away any category of gender and saying it's just sex, and we're defining sex based on the sex that was assigned to you at birth. It's a political move. It's definitely a political move, and it's cruel, it's inhumane, and all I can tell you is that if enough of us stand up and say we're not going to go along with this, we have our own voice and we speak up, I really do believe we can make a difference. I'd like to tell you that every lawsuit is a panacea and it automatically gets you the results that you want, but I can't say that for sure. Some of you might recall the Supreme Court back in the fall heard a case called Scrimetti, which involves what is the constitutionality of states that have banned gender affirming care for transgender youth. And it deals with Tennessee's statute. And the consensus after those arguments were probably there are enough conservative justices on that Supreme Court that probably will uphold the constitutionality of that kind of ban. But as I said, this is different, though. This is different. What this executive order is trying to do is saying overall, we recognize there's red states and blue states, and we recognize there's some good states for LGBTQ people and some bad states. We're going to prevent those good states. We're going to try to prevent those good states, like a state like Michigan, from doing the good stuff that they should do. And let's talk about the good stuff that we have in our state that other states don't necessarily have. First of all, we have a civil rights laws that explicitly protect transgender people, gender identity and gender expression, as well as gay and lesbian people, sexual orientation. We're one of 22 states that have those protections. And no executive order takes away our civil rights laws that we have there. That's really important. The other thing is we have a governor, we have an attorney general, we have a secretary of state who all have a record of supporting LGBTQ rights. And this is important because we are going to need to look to our allies who've been our allies in the past, and we're going to need to make asks of them to do things. So like, I'm glad somebody in the chat said, what about Dana Nessel? Has she done something? Well, hopefully she will. But what we need to do, all of us collectively, we need to contact her office and tell her we need her to do something like this. We need to rely on every tool in our arsenal that can help make a difference. What else do we have that's good in our state? Well, because of our secretaries of state, we have really good ID document policies in terms of your state ID and your driver's license, being able to change your gender marker. Now, the Trump issued an executive order concerning federal ID, preventing people from having a gender marker that accurately reflects who they are, but that has no effect on our state ID policy. We recently passed legislation that allows people to change their gender marker on their birth certificate just based on self-attestation. The statute used to say you had to show that you had undergone surgery. That's no longer in the statute. We also passed legislation that streamlines the legal name change process in Michigan. In other words, we no longer require a criminal background check for adults 22 years and older, and fingerprinting. Michigan was only the last 6 states that had that requirement. And we also now can allow, a court can grant a legal name change without a hearing if the paperwork's all in order, which can help speed up the process for people to have accurate a legal name change. So that's really important. Because of the election in 2024, we now have a progressive majority on Michigan's Supreme Court, and we're going to have to use our state civil rights laws to challenge discriminatory practices against LGBTQ people. And it's good to know that if a case eventually goes up to the Michigan Supreme Court, we hope to have majority of justices that see an expansive view of civil rights for LGBTQ people. That's really important. We lost the progressive majority in the House as a result of the 2024 elections, but we still maintain a progressive majority in the Michigan State Senate. That's very important because hopefully it will stop anti-LGBTQ legislation from being able to move forward and pass. Even though probably Governor Whitmer, we hope the government where Whitmer would veto that kind of legislation. And just to kind of give you an example, in the very first week of the Michigan legislature, the Republican majority in the Michigan House, what were the first things that they introduced? Two bills. One bill that prevented transgender students from being able to play sports in school, and the second bill that prevented transgender students from being able to access bathrooms and locker rooms in accordance with their gender identity. That is the first priority of this majority in the Michigan House. And what do we need to do? We need to call it out for what it is. You know, there are a lot of issues that Michigan residents are facing. This is the top priority. This is the policy initiative that this supposed leadership has to offer. We need to call that out. So I'm just going to say a few more things and then leave some time, of course, for people to have questions. Let's go back to people feeling helpless. What do I do? This is just so much. I think we just have to go back to some real basic things. One, we have a voice. And I used to think, oh, it's so silly on social media. Someone posts a statement, a political thing. I don't think it's so silly anymore. All of us, if we're on any form of social media, have the ability to publicly make a statement in support of the transgender community, be it about healthcare, be about anything. And I want to encourage people to do that. It is so important that the transgender community hear from people in their lives who know them, to let them know that we are standing up, we are standing behind them. We're going to make sure that they're not erased. As silly and as trivial as that stuff sounds, it's an easy first step that people can do. The second thing that we need to do is, once again, as I mentioned before, we need to call out our allies and ask them to stand up. I want to give you an example. And I'm not saying, that she's against LGBTQ rights. Alyssa Slotkin won election to the United States Senate. While she was still in the House, she voted in favor of a defense authorization bill that prohibits the paying for gender-affirming care for transgender youth of military people. Gary Peters also, in the Senate, also voted in favor of that. Okay, I know they probably didn't like that provision. Why did they vote for that? Why did they feel they needed to vote for that? We need to ask those questions. Both Gary Peters, who, by the way, is retiring next year, so he doesn't have to worry about election, and Alyssa Slotkin, who is beginning a 6-year term, doesn't have election again until 2030, voted in support for Homeland Security Kristi Noem, who has a long, detailed history of anti-LGBTQ positions and statements. Why? Why did they vote? We need to ask these people, if they call themselves allies of the community, how are they showing that? And why did they do that? It's a fair thing. And then we also have to decide, what do we want from them? I want to make sure that Governor Whitmer, who has a great record on LGBT rights, I want to make sure that if there's, if they're going to say no federal funding for gender affirming care from Medicaid, I want to know that her administration are looking for ways to pay for that gender affirming care. I think that's a fair question to ask. I want to know that my elected representatives, either in Washington or Lansing, are opposing these efforts to discriminate against the LGBT people and and for the most part, transgender people. I want to know. So, in other words, we're going to have to know who. And I realize this is a very well-informed group, but I'm just talking in general. We're going to have to know who our elected representatives are. And we're going to have to make some phone calls and send some emails and let them know. And then, finally, I think we in terms of what else that we can do, we have to have an understanding of what the law is. In the last 2 days, I think I've dealt with 4 or 5 different medical programs that are talking about either ending gender affirming care for current patients or saying we're not taking any future patients and we're going to, cancel those appointments for evaluations. And I can only say that I think they're getting some bad legal advice, telling them to do this sort of thing. So all of us need to be up to date and aware of what the law says about all these things. And, and this is just the bottom line kind of human thing. Let's make it very clear. President Trump was elected with less than 50% of the vote. This is not a mandate in terms of voters. They did polling. up about the people who voted. And the issue of transgender people was absolutely last, number 39, and all these other issues. This is not what people want, and we don't have to accept this, but we have to make our voices heard on this. And of course, we have to keep up to date. So I'm going to stop talking and see if I can answer questions and comments that people might have.
Thanks, Jay. I'm sure you can answer questions. So first one is there's people considering getting the X removed from their state ID and changing it back to either male or female. Would you say it's safe to change that currently at this time?
I would not advise people to get rid of the X on their state ID. As mentioned before, we have our own policies and procedures for our state ID documents. And the current policy, the Secretary of State policy, is that this is an option for you. Now, could that change? After the 2026 election, Jocelyn Benson will no longer be Secretary of State. Depending on who Michigan elects, you could find somebody who's hostile to that. And that certainly was true with the former Secretary of State, Ruth Johnson, who made it virtually impossible to get accurate ID documents. And the ACLU ended up suing her office. But at this point in time, I wouldn't change it back. I would keep what you have. We tried to make this in law too, in terms of the current Secretary of State policy, but there weren't the votes during the lame duck session to be able to move that provision forward. But it's important that we keep in mind that we keep our state ID documents separate from the issue of the federal ID documents.
Would that change? Would your answer change if the person was concerned about traveling to other states that did not offer that, or if they were traveling, via airports going into other states or out of the country?
That exists now. There's other states that don't allow for an X marker. There are other states now that don't allow people to be able to change the gender marker on their driver's license or state ID. The bottom line is the jurisdiction over that lies within the state of Michigan. Now, it's a good thing now, and we want to keep that good thing now. So I think what's very important in 2026, not only who we elect as our governor and our attorney general, but also who we elect as our Secretary of State. And we have to be aware and engaged in that. But I wouldn't recommend that people do something like that.
Okay. Next one is that Elon Musk just infiltrated the Treasury, though. So couldn't that affect the distribution of funds? It seems like they are operating outside the law altogether. So can the courts really stop anything at this point?
Well, I think the courts did. There was an attempt to, whether it was Elon Musk or whoever was the acting director of Office of Management Budget, they tried to freeze everything, and they tried, and it became a big disaster. And then 2 court orders were entered against them. I imagine, there'd be the same legal challenge, but wow, this is an unprecedented thing. And, there's so much cacophony going on about all the stuff that this administration is doing. But what we should be very concerned about is you have an unelected person who donated $300 million to a campaign who's essentially being given this person has not been nominated, has not been vetted, there's not been any background check, has been given the keys to, our institutions of government and to private, records that could raise security concerns without any oversight whatsoever. And I think we're going to see some legal challenges to that. But what really has to happen is the legislative branch has to stand up to something like that. So, and of course, this is Jay saying his own opinions. I don't know what the ACLU says about this, but, obviously it seems like the Republican Party doesn't seem to have any voice against any of these things that are going on. They just remain silent. I think what has to happen with the minority party, the Democrats, they have to speak up about this. And they have to say, okay, you're going to do this. We're not going to approve a budget. We're not going to allow, if there's anything, procedurally they can do, we're not going to let you hold hearings on your cabinet nominations, or we're not going to let you hold a vote on. They have to try to slow things down as much as possible and gum up the works as much as possible, because otherwise these unprecedented assaults on our mechanism of democracy, these three branches that are supposed to provide checks and balances, are going to fall apart. And so their voice has to be there. And they have to stop thinking about the next election. They have to be thinking about what's the future of our form of government. So it seems like, and this is once again, Jay, my soapbox, so many politicians, it seems like their ability to stay in power, Trump's, I don't even want to say that word, supersedes any interest in how our government functions. And it's a really sad thing to say. And we have to have the opposition's voice louder and more aggressive and making it clear that this is totally unacceptable.
Dr. Snyder, you have a question? They can't unmute.
I think she's still on mute.
Yep, sorry. All right. I will try and figure
Yes,
it out.
thank you. I wasn't able to unmute. So yeah, I'm a physician, and not asking obviously for individual recommendation, but just I guess in general, like oftentimes my patients, I'm a family doctor who they go to Europe for 6 months and they have stable blood pressure. I'll give them 6 months to 12 months of their hypertension medicine so they can not run out of that medicine when they're like out of the country, knowing that their medicine they'd have to just pay for it with cash. And I've got patients who are worried about running out of other kinds of medicines. And I'm just trying to think about um, how real you worry about adult access to certain medicines for being things that my patients are right to be concerned about. Or if you think that, like you said, they shouldn't be rushing to change their gender marker. Should I be telling my patients they shouldn't be rushing to start like accessing lots of meds they're worried about being concerned about losing, or if that's a valid fear that they might have.
Mhm. You know, some of my colleagues, we were acknowledging an email. There's a lot of questions, and a lot of times it's hard to give an answer. I
Hmm.
wish I did have a crystal ball and I
Right.
could tell you everything was going to be fine, and that ultimately all these legal challenges, if they go up to the United States Supreme Court, that this United States Supreme Court is going to do the right thing. But I'll be honest with you, I don't have a lot of faith in this
Hmm.
conservative majority on the court. And I have heard about people stockpiling on some of their hormones and things like that
Hmm.
because they're concerned what could happen. And we know when you interrupt that method of treatment, it can have serious physical as well as mental health consequences.
Hmm.
So I certainly wouldn't say someone don't do that if that's a
Right.
possibility. And I don't know if you could tell people, yes, do that sort of thing. I think an individual has to figure out what might be
Hmm.
best for them. This is pretty unprecedented when you
Yeah.
think of it. And we've made so much progress in the area of transgender rights and access to healthcare, particularly in the state of Michigan, where we have probably one of the best Medicaid programs in the country in
Hmm.
terms of covering gender affirming care. And look at this all out assault from the executive branch, from this
Hmm.
administration, even against our own state. So I would, if you ask me personally, I don't think that's so far-fetched. Somebody fearing about their access to medication and wanting to ensure that, that they might continue to be having access to that medication.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right, Jay, I have another one that's medically related that I think
Sure.
is right. So they have two questions. One is if one of the patients tells us that they're being told programs are being shut down in the state of Michigan, how exactly should we advise them to report this? And then when they have patients calling asking to change a diagnosis code for surgeries or care that has already occurred, we can't do this because it would be considered fraudulent. Is there anything in the executive order about that information being available in the federal government, or is it still protected by HIPAA?
So first of all, if someone hears about a program saying they're shutting down services, contact me at the ACLU. Let us know about this, and we're going to follow up on it. And like I said before, depending on the circumstances, we believe that some of these programs might be in violation of our state civil rights laws. And if that is the case, don't have any reservations about filing complaints against them with the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. With regards to surgery, changing diagnosis codes, remember the executive order is dealing only with transgender youth, although we know that most surgical procedures are not available to youth under the age of 18. But of course, if someone is 18, they are eligible for surgical procedures and things like that. Should they change the diagnosis codes and stuff? I mean, I'm not a medical professional, and I don't specialize in medical ethics. You know, uh, I sometimes when I talk with medical providers, sometimes it does depend on, different codes and stuff, how certain things can be covered. Um, I guess I don't have any clear. I'm not going to tell people to violate, if there's a certain ethical code and to lie about certain diagnoses, these codes in order to have things covered. Um, but I do think we need to ensure, I think we need to understand that this threat about gender affirming care, some of these proponents of policies like this, not only are they aiming for trans youth not to receive that form of care, like puberty blockers and hormone therapy, the next step, they would love to see a ban on gender affirming care for adults, including surgery. And we have to be ready for that.
All right, Melanie, you have a question? You have your hand up?
Yes, I do. First, I want to say thank you for having this. It's super informative. I have a trans partner and both adults, and they are already noticing with some ordering of HRT that there has been difficulties at multiple different pharmacies to even get it. Some are either not allowing it, others are charging it in full and not allowing insurance to go through, others are allowing insurance, and some just, it's been difficult already just in the last 2 weeks. Is there something that we can do? When we've noticed this with other friends throughout the state as well, what do we do here?
Okay. So we need to know if there are pharmacies that are refusing to fill the prescription, because the executive order, excuse me, doesn't apply to any pharmacies that I'm aware of, and as far as private insurance covering things, there's nothing in the executive order preventing private health insurance from covering these things. It's only dealing supposedly in terms with federal dollars. The only thing I can think of is if a pharmacy believes they're not a healthcare center, they're not a hospital, they're not a university, they're not receiving any grants. So I don't see how the executive order, regarding saying we'll take away all federal funds that a pharmacy doesn't receive federal funds from the government. It utilizes different forms of insurance to pay for medication. So I guess the only thing I can tell you is what they're doing is not dictated by this executive order, which once again is not law and which is legally flawed, constitutionally flawed. There should be no reason that they're doing that. And please let us know about it and we will follow up on it. It clearly, I think doing something like that, at the very least, is violating our state civil rights laws.
Okay, thank you.
I do want to interject just one thing, because there's been a lot of chatter around that specific topic about clinics or systems refusing care and wanting individuals and community members to report to the ACLU and to Laura. And just careful that you are relying on accurate information, because I know I've had like 2 people reach out to me to confirm something that is blatantly not true. Because I actually spoke to the person in charge and responsible, and the information is getting twisted. So I just want to be cautious about that, because everybody's very emotional. There's a lot of anxiety, and it almost feels like we're feeding into people's fears and now having people report on each. And so, Jay, on that, I want to clarify with you, asking people to reach out to the ACLU for this, is that for the ACLU to get those people in clinics into trouble, or is that just to clarify with them and help them understand they don't have to comply?
I think it's to clarify that and help them understand that they don't have to comply. And I appreciate you saying that, Jenny. Obviously, we're not going to raise an allegation with a program if it's not based in fact. We would have to have information that definitely shows. And I know you and I had a conversation, okay, is there something in writing that says this is what they're doing? Do we have something that shows that? It's not enough that someone's overheard this or thinks this. And sometimes what happens is uh there might be a conversation about, okay, so for instance, what is our contingency plan? For some reason, if this executive order was upheld and it starts taking effect, what do we do? Having those conversations doesn't mean that, automatically you're stopping services. So you're right. It's very important to make sure what you're hearing can be verified by sources. But you know what? Even if there's some rumors and stuff that you're hearing to come to us, and, we can look into that too.
Thank you.
We just want to be aware of this, what this lawsuit that was filed by the National ACLU and Lambda talks about is actual programs that have shut down around the country and the harm that's been done to family. They're looking for these stories to illustrate the harm and why the federal court needs to issue this injunction to stop this harm from happening to people.
Thank you. Dr. Lori? I think you're unmuted, Lisa, but we can't hear you.
See the hand raise sign.
I know, they're not.
Oh, having computer issue.
Oh, okay. All right, let me know when you're ready, Lisa. I have another couple questions in here. There's been some talk about marriage equality being overturned. How likely do you think that is?
Well, it would have to come through a case. Certainly the Trump administration could not issue an executive order, doing away with marriage equality. I think some people, what's that? They could try, but it wouldn't have that impact of being able to do that. We've seen some state legislatures, you've probably heard, I think it was Idaho, where they passed a resolution asking the United States Supreme Court to revisit the decision's called Obergefell versus Hodges. That's the marriage equality decision. We also know that there's two justices currently on the Supreme Court, Justice Alito and Justice Thomas, who've called for that decision to be revisited. They thought it was wrong. They voted against it. So could there be a likelihood that the United States Supreme Court could reverse the marriage equality decision? If you asked me a couple years ago, I would tell you no. But after we saw what the Supreme Court did with the Roe v. Wade decision and the way that they reached that decision, usually when you reverse a case decision, you're able to point to a change in legal precedent. In other words, you're showing, well, other courts have found this has changed the analysis. There was nothing there in the Dobbs case resulting in the overturning of Roe v. Wade. What this court majority seemed to demonstrate is if they wanted to reach a particular outcome, they could do so. So could this happen with marriage equality? Yes, it could. Will it happen tomorrow? No. It would have to be through a case, take some time to work that up before a court, sometimes 2, 3, 4 years at the earliest. But, what would happen if they reversed it? Well, they couldn't reverse marriages that were already granted. What they would do is they would return the decision about whether same-sex couples could get married back to the individual states. Now, keep in mind, in Michigan, we have a law from 1996 that still is on the books, was never removed, that prohibits same-sex couples from getting married. And then in addition, voters in 2004 passed an amendment to our Constitution, which is still in our Constitution, which also prohibits same-sex couples the right to marry. So if the U.S. Supreme Court reversed the marriage equality decision, we would revert back to these laws and this constitutional amendment in Michigan. And so what we would need to do in the event of this reversal, we'd have to get rid of at least, for the most important thing, the constitutional amendment. To get rid of a constitutional amendment requires 2/3 of the legislature to vote in favor of that. That's not going to happen. And in Michigan, so it would have to be a ballot initiative. And so, the majority of voters would have to vote on that. Ballot initiatives are incredibly expensive, at least $25 million, and requires very sophisticated methods getting the signatures. And I think if we did something like that, not only would we want to get rid of that out of the Constitution, but we would also want to make sure something was put in our Constitution to make it absolutely clear that same-sex couples have the right to get married. So that is a real concern. And I'll share with you what my fears are about this concern. I think we can plan for this, but I think sometimes I fear that this concern about marriage equality will overtake the most immediate concern is about the welfare of our transgender community. In other words, some people will say, well, I don't care about those transgender people. All I care about is marriage equality. So I'm not going to put resources, effort, or even raise my voice for those issues. I'm only going to focus on marriage equality. And believe me, there are opponents of LGBTQ rights that would love to sow this division between the two communities. I haven't seen that happen yet, and I hope it doesn't happen. Let's make no mistake. The top priority, the most immediate harm that is coming to our community is to our transgender community. But we can walk and we can chew gum at the same time. We need to stand up strongly and fight back against all these attempts to marginalize and erase the transgender community, while at the same time looking at the realistic possibility that a couple of years down the line, the marriage equality decision could be vulnerable to being overturned. And what do we do about that? We can do both, but let's not, allow this division to happen. And let's not have some people say we're only putting resources in the marriage equality area, because we do great harm to our transgender people. And, one thing I always say to people who question, and it's not many people, but, why is this transgender thing? It's different than being gay or lesbian. Let's make it absolutely clear. Every positive development that we have gained towards LGBTQ rights in the last 50 some years started with the transgender community, started with the Stonewall uprising. Those were transgender women of color who stood up to law enforcement that were raiding bars and harassing customers. All the federal cases that have resulted in saying discrimination against LGBTQ people is sex discrimination, that came from cases involving transgender people. Amy Stevens was our client, and her case went up to the United States Supreme Court 5 years ago, resulting in a decision. She was fired from her job for being trans. And they combined her case with 2 cases involving gay employees who also were fired when it was discovered they were gay. And the Supreme Court, a different Supreme Court in 2020, held this was sex discrimination, resulting in the first time ever federal civil rights protections for LGBTQ people, once again, came from the transgender community, because the motivation of discrimination against LGBTQ people is based on sex stereotypes. I don't like you because you don't look, you don't act, you don't behave, and you don't love the way I think someone assigned a certain gender at birth should be. That's the whole rationale behind this. So we are, and likely as we should be, we are tied together. And any effort to dismantle the rights of the transgender community, which the executive order is just the first plank in the effort to dismantle the rights of gay and lesbian people. So once again, that's Janice's soapbox, but I just wanted to make that clear. Keyword, intersectionality, absolutely.
Dr. Lori put their question in the chat. Are you aware of any conversations that the healthcare systems have been having with the ACLU in Michigan for guidance? Or is that an option? I'm adding that last part.
It is an option. I mean, obviously, Jenny, I've spoken with your group. I spoke with a group of providers through the University of Michigan, their gender services program. I've had conversations with other, excuse me, medical programs that are offering gender affirming care. Not any formalized thing, but just kind of like we're doing tonight, trying to answer questions. And you know, it'd be great if somebody wanted to form some kind of health consortium of providers of gender affirming care that we could get together on, on a semi-regular basis to talk about updates and to have these conversations. I think that would be really important. And I think the sharing of these ideas and having an understanding of what an executive order does and what it doesn't do, what's the current state of the law, I think that might be helpful guidance to some of these programs that kind of feel, under attack, rightfully so, and afraid, rightfully so.
Right. Thanks, Jay. Thanks for using the consortium's name in that. Dr.
Yeah.
Snyder.
Oh, I mainly wanted to make sure you saw Dr. Lowry's comment in the in the chat, since she and I are in the same healthcare system. And then also, I put the name of a mail order pharmacy, Honeybee Health. I've worked with them through after meeting them at an abortion and contraception conference, and they do a great job getting low cost hormones to folks without using insurance. So if people are needing like immediate access to hormones, struggling with insurance or struggling with pharmacies, they're physically located in California but mail throughout the country. So they are definitely like a safe pharmacy to use, and also very good low cost for people without insurance. So I put their info in there. Feel free to share widely.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that's going to be important. And, I think there is a concern that, just like, trying to use the Comstock Act in terms of, abortion medications and stuff, will there be some efforts, in Congress to try to regulate in terms of various medications for gender affirming care that way as well. I saw something in there, Jenny. I haven't been watching the chat thing about Planned Parenthood, and I am glad to see that they're committed. Now, Planned Parenthood, based on my understanding, they serve people 17 years and older, but I think they might be able to start working with youth 16 years and older. And it's great that they are there and that they don't necessarily have to rely on, federal funds and stuff to be able to offer their services. Yeah. It's interesting. I think if these healthcare programs, if we can get as many of them to stand together right now and say, you know what? We question about this executive order. There's a lot of complications and stuff, and we know it's being litigated. And hopefully there'll be an injunction issued, very preliminary injunction issued fairly soon against this. I hope that we might hear from a lot of the programs saying, okay, this is what's going on. We're going to continue doing what we're doing.
And there was a question or a comment more in the chat. It said, would love a list of state officials we can contact and what to ask of them specifically to help. And I know I've seen a couple of things online about that was super easy. I don't know how I would find it right away, but I think there is some information floating around there.
Well, I mean, let's talk about some things that we could do. Yeah, there certainly is content. Let's just talk with our U.S. two senators. There was in the U.S. House, they passed a bill banning transgender students from being able to play sports in accordance with their gender identity. By the way, I don't know if you heard, the Michigan High School Athletic Association issued a statement last week saying that out of 175,000 students who play interscholastic sports, they could only identify 2 transgender students that play sports. So this is how small that we're talking about. At any rate, the bill now goes to the United States Senate. Now, there is a thing called the filibuster. You need 60 votes in order to, start debating and actually addressing a bill. So chances are there won't be, there's 53 Republican votes. There won't be 7 Democrats crossing over to allow this bill to move forward. But we want to make sure, given some of the stuff that they've recently done, that both our senators, Gary Peters and Alyssa Slotkin, are going to vote against, are going to prevent this from happening. And so that's one ask that we can make, right? We can contact our attorney general. I'm not trying to cause problems for her, but just saying, asking, are you going to maybe issue a letter to these healthcare programs like Tish James did Letitia James in New York, AG did, and I believe maybe the AG in Maryland also issued a similar a letter. Are you gonna be doing that? That's a good thing to ask. I think we can contact the governor's office and say, okay, in the event that you can't use federal money for Medicaid dollars for gender affirming care, we'd like you to explore other ways that you could offer that using state dollars. It's not anything hostile or anything like that. In our state legislature, you saw that, the House, they introduced those two bills. Contact your state representative in the House and tell them to oppose the trans sports ban bill and the thing about the bathrooms and the locker room. So those are some things that you can do right now.
And I know if some of you aren't following the Grand Rapids Trans Foundation, that's a good place to follow because they do post about these bills and how people can help contact who to contact and how to reach them, specifically when it's talking about legislation around transgender rights.
That's great. And I just want to mention too, we have a number of transgender specific organizations, and I'm thinking in particular, Stand With Trans, which provides support to families as well as members or transgender individuals, including mental health services. And I think especially now, given all that's happening right now, I mean, you talk you had an executive order changing the definition of sex. You had an executive order about passports and federal IDs. You had the military ban. You had about federal prisons taking away gender affirming care, moving people out of safe housing. You had the executive order regarding schools, threatening to take away money from schools that are supportive trans students. And you have this healthcare ban. I mean, talk about your quadruple whammy going on here. And you can imagine how members of the transgender community and their families and friends who love them, how they must be feeling right now. So if you're able to support these organizations that are providing support services, please do.
All right. Any other questions? I don't see any others in the chat. Dr. Hoppe asked me to repeat the name of that group. It was the Grand Rapids Trans Foundation.
Yep. And it's Simone Kita, right? Who's head of it?
Yep.
Yeah. And Simone, we have we have an LGBTQ plus public policy group that meets monthly, and Simone is always part of that. And we discuss things that are happening in the state of Michigan as well as at the federal level and things that people can do. And once again, the silly stuff on social media. If you are on social media, do an affirmative statement in support of transgender people. Speak out. Your voice does count. It does mean something. Someone asked about if you thought about going to Blue Sky and leaving Twitter. I'm not on Twitter. I might have a name, but I've never even gone on there. Yeah, I thought of it. I go back and forth because I feel, very upset with in terms of Zuckerberg and the stances and what's happening with Facebook, and don't want to support that. On the other hand, I feel that I am part of a community that shares my values and that we do share that kind of information. And part of me thinks I shouldn't have to give that up or don't want to have to give that up in terms of trying to reach people. So I think it's an individual choice that people have to make. But we do have to look at, some of these billionaires who have, become sycophants for this administration and the things that they're doing. And do we want to continue supporting their financial interests and stuff? How do we register our disapproval regarding things like that? And that's, something for everybody to consider and figure out what might work best for them.
Jay, we got another question about IDs. Does the federal restriction around gender marker on federal ID documents affect the validity of a Michigan issued enhanced driver's license?
It does not. It does not. No. I mean, because once again, different states have different policies about gender marker changes, but this is our policy. This is the way we do it. And that's part of the independence of states to decide something like that. Now, of course, we do know with regards to passports, they will not, prospective passports, they will not change the gender marker, and any application to change a gender marker that was in process at the time of Trump taking office on January 20th. They stayed the process. And, there's still a lot of things unanswered. What does that mean, in terms of when you have to, let's say my passport does reflect my gender identity, and 3 years from now, I just need to renew my passport. Does the federal government know that the gender marker, reflects my gender identity instead of something else? Could they change it? We don't know those answers. I will tell you something, but don't tell anybody you heard it from me, that we will probably see a legal challenge filed against the passport policy later this week.
Okay.
That
Good.
hopefully will also result in a preliminary injunction against enforcing this, at least for the time being. The whole purpose of this litigation, litigation takes years, but the major purpose is to slow things down and stop them from taking effect. And that's what we're going to try to do.
Good.
Put sand in the gears.
Jay, will the talk tomorrow you're doing, with Equality Michigan and Stand with Trans, will that be similar to tonight's topics?
It'll be very similar. And I want to thank all of you. You're kind of like a dry run for this. We're going to go through more specifics about the executive orders, and we're going to talk about, specific things related to those orders. So it's not only just healthcare, we're going to deal with education and some of those other things. But pretty much, we were able to do in an hour and answer questions that we'll probably be doing in an hour and a half.
Okay, good.
And it will be recorded. If people are, if you don't want to attend or if you're not able to attend, you'll be able to access that. And I think what we'll probably do, not every 2 weeks or anything like that, but when there needs to be an update, we'll probably have more community forums. One of the things that I was just talking with Emmy Zanotti, who is the political director for Equality Michigan, we're trying to figure out what is the best use of our time and resources. And as much as we would love to talk to individuals about their own situation, their own scenario, it's probably not going to be the best use of time to do that, to do that on a regular basis, but more, and obviously if someone contacts me, I'm not going to say, I'm not going to answer you because, there's a forum in 2 weeks from now. I certainly wouldn't do that. But how do we reach the largest amount of people and to be able to provide that information to the largest amount of people? That's kind of what we'll be focusing on. So this is a great forum, through Zoom. You're not asking me to drive out to Grand Rapids, as much as I love coming to Grand Rapids and love to see people in person. This is a more efficient way to do things. And that's the way we're going to have to folk, that's the way we're going to want it to follow things like this.
Jay, the recording for tomorrow, will that be housed on Equality Michigan's website?
Good question. We're hosting it on our Zoom thing.
Okay.
So I imagine we'll create a link and then people will be able to access it through the link.
Okay. And then you and I had talked about follow-up for this, and it's not always feasible for you to do these kind of Zooms, but you thought, is the ACLU or are you able to do some kind of a newsletter update, or is there a way that we can get information or keep up to date on this?
If you, Jenny, could maybe, and maybe I have it from your little listserv that you sent with the link, what I can do then is when I know that there's updates. So for instance, with this lawsuit, I could, send you the complaint and the press release from the ACLU, and we could do updates that way.
Okay. Yeah, it would be everybody on the invite tonight.
So the thing that you sent. Okay. So maybe I'm making myself a note. When we're done with this call, I'm going to send out the complaint and the press release from the ACLU about the current lawsuit. So everybody has, greater understanding what's going on with that.
One of the questions, Jay, or maybe it's a request, is New York just made it so that medical providers do not have to put their name on prescriptions for abortion medications. Is that possible that Michigan might be able to do the same?
Was it legislation that was passed or what?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's talk about the reality. Anything pro-LGBTQ is not going to be able to become law in at least the next 2 years. You have a conservative majority, Republican-controlled House, and I've been at the ACLU, this is going to be my 25th year. And up until 2023, we could never move anything forward because the majority party won't allow any, at least this is tradition, anything that's pro-LGBT to even get a hearing to be able to be voted out of a committee. So in New York, you have a progressive majority in both houses. And these are the consequences of the elections. And these are things, I'm not saying all of us didn't know, but these are things we have to let other people know. If you want to see, pro-LGBTQ laws and legislation, you have to elect progressive majorities. And when you don't have that, this is what happens. You can't move anything forward. It only took 46 years to get civil rights law legal protections for the LGBTQ community. Introduced every single session, died every single session until 2023, when after 40 years, you had a progressive majority in both the House and the Senate. Makes a big difference.
All right, I don't see any new questions in the chat. Does anyone have any final comments or questions that they would
People
want to?
can also, email me. Let's put my email address in the chat. If they think of something that comes up, this doesn't have to be the last time or the limit on any questions or issues that might come up. So there you go.
Thank you, Jay.
Sure.
Thank you for giving up some of your time. I know you and I were communicating all over the weekend and all hours of the night. So hopefully that stops soon or lessens. So, but thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. If you continue to have questions, please reach out. We're happy to, Jay and I are both happy to share however we can and connect people with resources that they may need. So reach out, stay connected, stay grounded in facts and truth, and see how much we can move forward.
Yes, and take good care of yourselves. It's so important. If you need a break, take the break when you need it. Find whatever in your life that brings you joy, because we have to be strong during this period. And the only way we can stay strong and be invested in this work is if we also, self-care is not being selfish. It's like you got to take care of your car to make sure that it runs, and the same thing holds true. I'm a terrible example of that, but I'm going to learn to be better. And I hope everybody else does too.
Yes. So everyone have a good night. Reach out if you need anything. And like Jay said, take care of yourselves.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Bye.